Morning, everybody. I am what it says on the slide, Chief Economist at the Nuffield Trust, and I wear black for a reason these days. Sorry, just in advance of my talk. It's not the cheeriest talk ever, but the purpose of talking about this is not to depress you all, but actually I think that we do need to think about not just what we're doing this year or even what we're doing for the next 2 years, but the longer term context, because I think in thinking about the longer term context, it will actually really influence and shape some of our priorities in the shorter term. So that is, and what I'm going to talk through is work that we've been doing at the Nuffield Trust with colleagues at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, looking at what's the scale of the productivity challenge, and rather than looking at the current 3-4 year period, looking at a decade. I have a lot of numbers. I will explain all of them. Apologies. In essence, this is my everything you need to know about public finance on one slide chart. So what this chart shows is the bars show you the percentage of GDP spent on public services since the late 1970s. And as you can see, end of the 1970s, IMF in, we're in deep trouble. We were spending high 40% of GDP on public services. We had a recession in the early 1990s. Again, we tipped up to just above 40%. And then the economic crash of 2007-8, again, we tipped up to over 40%. Yeah? During this period, tax receipts have fallen as a share of GDP from above 40%, about 45, 46% in the early 1980s, to systematically below 40% pretty much ever since. And the reason why we have a huge public sector deficit is the difference between about 47% in 2008 of our GDP on public spending compared to a tax take of about 37% of GDP. Now, as you can see, what's happening over the next, this is up to 2016-17, is we're bringing those two into line by cutting public spending as a share of GDP very dramatically. Yeah? So by about 8 percentage points of GDP, which is a huge amount of money. The health service is exempt from that. Yeah? Other public services and welfare spending are taking the strain. Yeah? Now, during this period, where tax fell, yeah, and public spending actually over the 30-odd years will have fallen, barring the recession, health spending doubled as a share of GDP. So we managed to pull off a trick where we we cut taxes, we cut public spending, and we doubled health spending. And the reason we did that, and were able to do that, and I think it's a really important context for the public debate about this, because health spending went up without the public feeling they were having to pay a whole lot more for it over quite a long period, more than all my working life, and I'm not young anymore, as my kids remind me. And so it's deemed normal to be able to rapidly increase health spending without raising taxes, despite us having a tax-funded system. And the reason we were able to do that is there have been major changes in what the state does during that period. So we privatised all the utilities, yeah? Big reduction. We've halved defence spending as a share of GDP on the back of the Cold War dividend. Yeah? We do very little investment in social housing anymore, and most recently we've largely exiting higher education. One of the things that I think is really important to think about here is that the scope to do that, I think, is coming to an end. The state now is left doing largely what Beveridge envisaged, providing a welfare state. It's much more difficult to see where those major changes in what the state does can come from that would allow health to grow without taxes and public spending as a whole growing. Okay. And the picture, sorry, this is a Treasury chart, and their numbers are very good, but they don't do pretty charts. But I'll explain this. So what the picture actually, I think, in the medium term for health and other public services is even more challenging than that suggests. So that line at the top is public spending as a whole, totally managed expenditure in the jargon. That's the thing that comes down to about 40%. It's worth saying that by 2017-18, we're still not actually in balance. Yeah, we've still got a deficit, a small one, but we've still got a deficit. Now, public spending is split into two bits. Departmental expenditure limits, which are the dark line, and they go down very sharply, as you'll see. That's the pool that we health fish in. That's spending on public services, yeah? Health, education, transport, all those sorts of things. And then there's this thing called annually managed expenditure, and that's welfare payments, biggest of which is pensions, yeah? Very substantially pensions, disability benefits, etc., and debt interest, yeah? So, you know, one of the things that's also squeezing us when you're in the sort of economic situation we're in is that actually our debt interest payments are going up very, very sharply, even with low interest rates. So actually, the tightening for public services through to 17-18 at least, and we haven't eliminated the deficit by then, is even greater than the overall tightening because of the impact of pensions being locked in to rise by at least inflation or average earnings, etc. So there's upward pressure on pensions and there's debt interest. So the money available for public services is lower. So what we've done is try and look at, well, what if that's the macroeconomic and the fiscal context, what might all that mean for health service? And we've looked at 3 scenarios for how much money might be available. Carrying on with the flat reel that we're in at the moment, which is that bottom line, yeah? The very faint grey line at the top is returning to average spending. So you see that red line, that's how it was all going up. That's it all going up by the same amount again, about 4% a year. And the pale red line is health growing in line with GDP. And then we look at social care, implementing Deal Not as well. We'll focus that. So the work we've done is to look at, given the pressures from demography, rising burden of chronic disease, rising input costs, what's likely to be the gap then between money available and pressures if nothing changed? And this is the Quip or the Nicholson challenge. So we estimate that at 14-15 to be a bit less than the Department of Health said, about 13 billion on the PCT commissioned budget, which is not the whole health budget. If things carried on as is, over a decade, that'd be 44 billion. These are all in 10-11 prices, by the way. So looking at the short term, how might we narrow that gap? Well, the pay policy makes a huge and really important contribution here, about 5 billion out of the 13 billion. We looked at disease management, and really what we observed, and I'll just briefly explain this, is over the last decade, if I take as an example, the number of women aged 50 to 55 who had diabetes has increased, yeah? And so that drives utilisation. But actually, for a woman aged 50 to 55 with diabetes, her probability of being admitted to hospital, her number of outpatient tendencies, also has been increasing dramatically. So there's been an increase in the intensity, if you like, of our intervention with people. So what we looked at is, what if better care in the community, earlier diagnosis, all those sorts of things that we talk about in Quip, actually just stabilised, stopped that rising trend, yeah? So we think that there's, and that should be at the easier end, if you like, of the demand management. We estimate the savings for that. And then we looked at some really basic Quip actions, focusing on the better care value indicators, everyone getting to the average. Not very ambitious. But what we said is it's quite difficult to unlock all the efficiency savings from that because some of those are fixed costs or semi-fixed costs. So let's only take part of those savings. So with some fairly modest efforts, you might argue in some ways, productivity gains, we think 14-15 looks quite deliverable, hugely helped by the pay policy. So if that's true and we deliver Quip, where does that leave us? Well, if spending is flat real over this period, with a further Quip challenge of around 4% a year, Yeah? So that's about 28 billion by the end of the period. So 4% per annum efficiency savings for a decade. Yeah? Now, if health grew in line with GDP, that falls to about 12 billion, so less than 2% per annum. Yeah? And again, what you see is that if you start to reconfigure, to take out more of the semi-fixed costs around the sort of savings from lower average length of stay, etc., that you could probably, realise around 6 billion of extra savings if you carried on really shifting services and focusing on more appropriate care for long-term conditions. Again, you could get about another 6 billion. So with some very sustained effort over this period, it might be possible to live within the health budget, which is rising in line with GDP. But that leaves about £16 billion, which without either significantly higher productivity gain or action on pay, is very difficult to achieve. And the alternative, and we did polling, and there's a huge amount of public support for protecting the health budget, and even some appetite, when you ask the question very generically, for possibly a tax rise. But I want to really question how sustainable both those propositions are, okay? So the first thing we've looked at here is, if you want health to grow in line with the economic growth, about 2.4%, and you're funding the Deal-Not Commission, which the government's broadly signed up to now, and you do that without growing public spending, what's the impact on local government, transport, education, etc.? The impact for them is, on top of the huge cuts that they've had to date, their spending could grow by less than 0.5% a year out to 20 throughout this decade. And if you think about I don't know about you, I've got young children, I quite like there to be a primary school place for my youngest, and the demographic pressures there, the prospect of no investment in transport for that sort of period, and also the health impact of that. Is that a sensible thing for health? So I remember work on teenage pregnancies years ago. So one of the best ways to reduce teenage pregnancies was to give girls a good education. 5 good GCSEs was the most protective thing against a teenage pregnancy. So a health budget, is a health budget one that slashes, whose impact is to slash other public services in this way. In terms of tax, so if we wanted health to grow in line with GDP, but we also wanted all other public services to grow in line with GDP, over this decade, at the end, that means we need about extra £49 billion, either in welfare cuts or tax. Let me give you a sense of what that means in welfare cuts. Unemployment benefit, job seekers allowance, costs £6 billion a year total. So you'd kind of have to abolish that at least 6 times over. More, it's even more. So in terms of tax rates then, 1p on the basic rate of tax raises between £4 and £5 billion on the Treasury Ready Reckoner. So that's an increase in the basic rate of tax from 20p to 30p. And this matters not just for the next few years, but the Office for Budget Responsibility, who do the long-term fiscal forecast, have kind of looked out in the long term. And really, the message from their work, which confirms ours, is that an increase in health service productivity is absolutely an imperative for us. So what this shows is what might happen to health as a share of GDP, depending on the productivity performance of the health service. So let's assume, so the trend rate of productivity growth in the economy is around 2.2% a year. And as we heard, that's not brilliant by international comparisons, but that's what our trend rate of growth is, leaving aside recession. If health service matched that and its productivity grew by about 2% a year, health as a share of GDP would grow, but it would grow to levels which you see in other advanced countries that are perfectly sustainable economically over this sort of 50-year period. However, the ONS estimates of health productivity are that over the last sort of 15 years, it's reduced on average by minus 0.2% a year. Now, there are all sorts of problems with the measurement of productivity. It's almost certainly wrong in its absolute level, but it's broadly right. I think, and what you get there is if we carry on with the productivity that we've had for the last 10 to 15 years, health as a share of GDP around 25%. Now, the Americans spend, about 18% of their GDP on health at the moment, and they do function economically. So there is a view that says that actually that's perfectly sustainable. As societies get richer, they choose more health, other things, food, mobile phones, etc., become cheaper. And that creates the room for us to spend the money on health, and we're better off. There's equally US work that shows that if you have significant sectors of your economy, like health with very low productivity, actually that reduces your overall economic growth. And so the cake doesn't grow as fast as you need it to. What is undoubtedly the case is that if we were to get into that position, the sort of share of GDP that we'd be taking in tax, unless we change the way we fund our system, is beyond the sort of Scandinavian model. And nothing that we've ever had in terms of political economy, the appetite for in this country. We seem to be prepared to pay about 40% of our income as a nation in tax, yeah? And we get quite jittery if we go far above that. Our sort of conclusions from this are, yes, it's very tight at the moment. Beyond the current period, we really can't see any hope within the fiscal environment that we've got of health spending returning to its historic average. We find it really quite difficult to imagine health spending returning to GDP growth rates around 2% a year in the next spending review at least. And I think flat real, what we've got at the moment, is probably the best outcome that the health can anticipate up to at least 2017, 2018. So the really key challenge for the health service then is how to continue to deliver 4% efficiency savings year on year, not for 4 years, but I would argue for at least 7 or 8 years. And after that, probably to sustain itself at around 2% a year, which we have no history of doing on a sustained basis. In order to do that, we really, really need to look at how we use our workforce and how we pay our workforce and reward them as well. Other things will help, but at the moment, we're getting through on the back of the pay freeze. It will not be sustainable to have a pay freeze forever. And so people have got to think beyond the pay freeze about how they tackle workforce issues as well. Okay.